There is a photograph taken in 1899 that will stop you cold if you look at it long enough. A man sits in a chair reading a book. He is thin, extraordinarily thin, the kind of thin that suggests a body that burns itself as fuel, that consumes its own reserves in the service of the mind that drives it. Around him, in every direction, lightning is happening. Great crackling arcs of electrical fire, 20 feet long, writhing through the air of the laboratory like living things, like the visual representation of something that should not exist in proximity to a human being and yet, clearly, does. The man does not look up from his book. His expression is the expression of a man reading quietly at home on a Sunday afternoon. He is not performing calm. He is calm. The lightning is his. He made it, and he has made so much of it for so long that it no longer surprises him. The man's name is Nikola Tesla, and the story of his life is the strangest, most brilliant, most heartbreaking, and most consequential story in the entire history of human invention. Not because he invented more than anyone else, though he did. Not because he saw further than anyone else, though he saw so far that the world he described, wireless energy, global communication, robotics, resonant frequency weapons, sounded to his contemporaries like the ravings of a lunatic and sounds to us, a century later, like a description of the present. Not even because he was wronged more systematically and more thoroughly than perhaps any inventor in history, though he was, and the story of that wronging is still capable of producing a specific kind of rage in anyone who hears it told properly. Tesla's story stops you because it is the story of a man who understood things that the world was not ready for, and who paid for that understanding with everything. His money, his reputation, his health, his relationships, and ultimately, in the cold hotel room where he died alone in 1943, his life. He died in poverty. He died forgotten, or nearly so. He died having given the modern world the electrical infrastructure that powers every light, every motor, every machine in every building on every continent, and having received, in return, almost nothing. That story begins far from New York City and its laboratories and its patent wars and its newspapers. It begins in a village called Smiljan in what is now Croatia, in what was then the Serbian-populated region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It begins on the night of July 10, 1856, during a lightning storm. His mother, Duka Tesla, was a woman of extraordinary native intelligence who had never received a formal education but who had, in the fashion of the self-taught, developed a memory and a mental capacity that her son would inherit in amplified form. She could recite from memory the entirety of the Serbian epic poetry canon, thousands of lines, absorbed and retained with the effortless precision of a mind that processed information the way other minds process air. She invented small household tools and devices to make the work of managing a farm and a household more efficient, working with materials and problems in a way that was, by any reasonable definition, engineering. She had the engineer's temperament and the engineer's eye, and she passed both to her second son with the specificity of a genetic gift. His father, Milutin Tesla, was a Serbian Orthodox priest, a man of learning and considerable eloquence, who read widely and wrote poetry and delivered sermons that were reported to have genuine literary quality. He wanted his son Nicola to follow him into the priesthood. He was, in this ambition, entirely wrong about his son, as parents so often are, and the story of how that wrongness eventually resolved itself is one of the more painful threads in the early Tesla biography. The village of Smiljan was a small place, defined by the rhythms of the Serbian Orthodox church year and the agricultural routines of the surrounding farmland. Tesla would later describe his childhood there with a vividness that suggested a memory of unusual clarity. The smell of the hay, the particular quality of afternoon light in the valley, the sound of the village on feast days. He was a sensitive child, prone to intense sensory experiences that he described, in his autobiography, as sometimes almost overwhelming. A flash of lightning could produce, in him, a reaction of such intensity that it verged on pain. Loud sounds were physically disturbing. Certain textures were intolerable. He had visions not in any mystical sense, but in the precise visual sense of a mind that processed ideas as images, that saw its solutions in three-dimensional space before they existed in physical reality. He was, from the very beginning, a person whose inner life was extraordinarily rich and who found the gap between that inner life and the ordinary external world a source of continuous, barely managed friction. He was also, from very early, clearly extraordinary. At school, he could perform integral calculus in his head. His teachers, observing this, regularly accused him of cheating. The calculations were too fast, too accurate, too apparently effortless to have been performed by a student who was not somehow consulting a hidden answer. Tesla found these accusations baffling and deeply hurtful. He was not cheating. He was simply seeing. The calculations appeared to him as visual structures, as geometric objects that could be manipulated and measured in his mind with the precision of a draftsman working on a flat surface. The numbers were not abstractions. They were shapes, and the shapes had properties, and the properties yielded answers with the direct simplicity of seeing rather than the laborious mechanism of arithmetic. This visual spatial intelligence, this ability to construct and manipulate complete mechanical objects in his mind, in 3 dimensions with the full physical properties of the actual objects they represented, was the defining feature of Tesla's intellectual equipment, and it was something that no one around him in Smiljan had any framework for understanding. He was not merely smart. He was differently configured. His mind was built for a specific kind of engineering thinking that the world had not yet generated the tools to accommodate. At 17, Tesla nearly died. He contracted cholera several times, in a sequence of relapses that left him so weakened that his father, who had been insisting on a clerical career for his son, was forced to concede. During one of the worst episodes, near delirium, Tesla extracted a promise from Milutin. If he survived, he would be allowed to study engineering. His father agreed. Tesla survived. And the promise, extracted in extremis, changed the direction of everything that followed. He enrolled at the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz in 1875. He was 18 years old, recently recovered from near death, possessed of a mental apparatus of almost frightening power, and burning with the specific energy of a young man who has spent years waiting to begin and is finally beginning. He worked with an intensity that alarmed his professors. He studied for periods that other students found incomprehensible, 18, 19, 20 hours a day, not because he was struggling but because stopping felt like a waste, like leaving a problem half-solved when the solution was right there, just one more hour of focus away. And then, in his second year at Graz, something happened that would not resolve itself for 6 more years, but that, when it did resolve, would change the world. A professor named Jacob Possel demonstrated a Graham dynamo, a type of electrical generator, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that the device had a significant engineering weakness. It produced direct current, which was useful but limited, and it operated using a commutator, a mechanical component that converted the alternating current produced inside the machine into direct current. The commutator sparked. It wore out. It required constant maintenance. Tesla, listening to this description, said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for the professor to hear, that surely a motor could be designed that operated on alternating current directly, without any commutator at all. Professor Possel stopped the demonstration. He turned to face the young Serbian student, and he said, with the patient condescension of a man who has been teaching long enough to have heard every confident pronouncement from every brilliant student, that what Tesla was proposing was impossible, that it contradicted the fundamental principles of electrical engineering, that it had been tried and found wanting by men of greater experience and more years of study than Tesla possessed. He said it well, he said it kindly, and he said it with the absolute conviction of someone who was absolutely, completely, and permanently wrong. Tesla said nothing more, but inside his mind, something had been set in motion that could not be stopped. The problem of alternating current, how to generate it, how to transmit it, how to make a motor that ran on it without the mechanical complexity and continuous maintenance of the commutator, lodged itself in his thinking with the specific force of a question that demands an answer. He could not let it go. He did not try to let it go. He carried it with him through the remaining years of his education, through a subsequent period of study in Prague, through a period of emotional and physical collapse that is somewhat mysterious in its origins, through the early years of his working life, carrying the problem like a man carries a stone he intends to use, waiting for the moment of application. The moment came on a February afternoon in 1882 in a park in Budapest where Tesla was walking with a friend reciting verse from Goethe's Faust. He had memorized it, of course, the way his mother had memorized the Serbian epics when the solution arrived. Not gradually. Not through a process of systematic analysis that culminated in a conclusion. It arrived whole, complete, in an instant, as if the answer had been assembled in some chamber of his mind that operated below conscious attention and had simply, at this particular moment, with the specific angle of late afternoon sun and the specific lines of Goethe in his mouth, chosen to deliver its product to the surface. He saw it, in 3 dimensions, in full physical detail, a rotating magnetic field, 2 coils of wire, oriented at 90 degrees to each other, carrying alternating currents that were 90 degrees out of phase. The interaction of these fields producing a magnetic force that rotated continuously, not mechanically driven, not dependent on any physical commutator, but generated by the mathematics of alternating current itself, by the pure elegant geometry of waves. A motor that had no sparking parts, no wearing surfaces, no components that required replacement or maintenance. A motor that could run indefinitely on alternating current and that could, theoretically, be connected to electrical generators at any distance, because alternating current, unlike direct current, could be transmitted over wires at high voltage and then stepped down by a transformer at the point of use, losing almost nothing in transmission. He saw, in that moment in the park in Budapest, not merely a motor. He saw the entire architecture of the modern electrical power system. He saw power plants generating alternating current. He saw transmission lines carrying it across hundreds of miles. He saw transformers stepping it up and down. He saw factories running on it, homes lit by it, cities powered by it. He saw, in the space of what he described as a moment of incandescent clarity, everything. He grabbed a stick and drew the diagram in the dirt of the Budapest park. The diagram was, in all essential features, the diagram of the AC induction motor that he would patent 5 years later and that has been in continuous production, in forms directly descended from that design ever since. The motor in your refrigerator, the motor in your air conditioner, the motor in the pump that delivers water to your house, the motor in virtually every piece of rotating electrical machinery on Earth. All of it, in its fundamental operating principle, drawn in the dirt of a Budapest park by a 25-year-old Serbian engineer on a February afternoon in 1882. But visions, however complete, are not patents. Diagrams in the dirt are not working prototypes. The gap between understanding and building, the long, expensive, socially exhausting gap that separates the inventor from the invention, still had to be crossed. And crossing it required money, and money required contacts, and contacts required the kind of social navigation that Tesla found almost physically painful. He had come, by 1882, to Paris, where he worked for the Continental Edison Company, a franchise operation of Thomas Edison's American electrical empire, installing and maintaining Edison's direct current lighting systems across Europe. He was good at it. He was very good at it, in fact, better than anyone else in the Paris office, a fact that his superiors recognized and that generated the mixed response that unusual competence typically generates in institutional settings. Admiration layered over resentment, appreciation expressed as increased demands. He was given the hardest problems. He solved them. He was given the next hardest problems. He solved those too. And all the while, in the margins of his working life, in the evenings and the weekends and the hours stolen from the demands of the Edison installation work, he was developing the theoretical and mechanical foundations of what would become the Tesla AC system. Building models in his mind. Working through the mathematics. Preparing to build the physical devices that would prove to the world what he had seen in the park. In 1884, a senior manager at Continental Edison, recognizing Tesla's extraordinary ability, gave him a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison in New York and put him on a ship to America. Tesla arrived at Ellis Island in June 1884, with 4 cents in his pocket, some poems he had written, a drawing of a flying machine he was developing, and the letter of introduction to Edison. His luggage had been stolen somewhere in Europe. He had been robbed on the ship. He arrived in the most dynamic city in the Western Hemisphere with virtually nothing, and with, in the chambers of his mind, a revolution in electrical engineering that was worth more than everything Edison had ever built. The meeting between Tesla and Edison is one of the great encounters in the history of technology, and it is, in retrospect, almost tragic in its incomprehension. Edison was then 37, already a world-famous inventor, the Wizard of Menlo Park, the man who had given the world the phonograph and the practical incandescent light bulb and the entire concept of a commercial electrical power system. He was also, by 1884, a man deeply committed financially, intellectually, and emotionally to his system of direct current electrical distribution, which he had been developing and commercializing for years and in which he had invested his own capital and his own reputation on a scale that made any challenge to its supremacy a threat to everything he had built. He hired Tesla immediately, recognized his ability. You could not be Edison and fail to recognize Tesla's ability in a technical conversation. Put him to work on the DC dynamos that were the core of the Edison electrical system, which were malfunctioning persistently and expensively, and which the rest of Edison's team had been unable to fully correct. Tesla worked. He worked in the way he always worked, continuously, ferociously, with the total absorption of a man for whom the boundary between working and not working had essentially no meaning, because his mind was always working and the only question was whether his hands and body were keeping up. He redesigned 24 different types of standard Edison machinery. He improved the efficiency and reliability of the DC dynamos to a degree that impressed even Edison. He was, by any measure, the most valuable engineer Edison had ever hired. And at some point during this period, Tesla told Edison about alternating current, about the rotating magnetic field, about the motor he had designed in his mind and drawn in the dirt in Budapest. He explained, with the clarity and the contained excitement of a man who has been carrying a great secret for 2 years and finally has an audience worthy of it, that there was a better way, that the DC system had fundamental limitations that could not be engineered away, and that AC overcame all of them. Edison's response was dismissive, not merely skeptical, dismissive in the way of a man whose dismissal is itself a form of decision. He did not engage with the technical argument. He said that AC was dangerous, that the public would not accept it, that the DC system was the system he had built and the system he would continue to build. He may also have understood, at some level that he did not acknowledge even to himself, that if Tesla was right, he was wrong. Not merely wrong about a technical question but wrong about the entire strategy of his electrical business. Wrong in ways that would require him to abandon or drastically restructure an enterprise into which he had poured a decade of his life. Edison was not the kind of man who was wrong. There is also the matter of the money. Tesla later claimed that Edison had promised him $50,000, a very large sum in 1884, if he could significantly improve the performance of the Edison dynamos. Tesla believed he had fulfilled this condition. When he raised the matter with Edison, Edison laughed and said that Tesla did not understand American humor. The $50,000 had been a joke. Whether this exchange occurred exactly as Tesla described it, whether the misunderstanding was genuine or calculated, whether Edison was being callous or whether Tesla had misread a casual remark as a formal commitment, these questions cannot be definitively resolved a century and a half later. What can be established is the consequence. Tesla resigned from the Edison Company in 1885. He left, taking with him the complete intellectual architecture of the AC system, and he was 28 years old and broke in New York City with no employer and no patron and no resources beyond the ideas in his head. What followed was a period of his life that Tesla almost never discussed and that his biographers have found fragmentary and painful to reconstruct. He did a series of deals with investors who promised to fund the development of his electrical patents and then reorganized the companies they had formed with him in ways that left him without equity or control. He dug ditches for the Edison Electric Light Company, actual manual labor on the streets of New York, for $2 a day, a period of humiliation so acute and so obviously incongruous with his abilities that it reads, in the historical record, like something from a morality tale. The greatest electrical engineer alive, digging trenches for the company of the man who had dismissed his ideas, while those ideas circled in his mind with the restless, urgent patience of things waiting to be released. The release came in 1887, when a lawyer named Charles Peck and a businessman named Alfred Brown agreed to fund Tesla's work on the AC motor. They gave him a laboratory on South Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, a salary, and, crucially, the commitment to pursue patents on whatever he developed. Tesla went to work. In less than a year, working with an intensity that his assistants found almost frightening, he had built working prototypes of the AC induction motor, the AC generator, and the transformer designs that formed the complete Tesla electrical system. He applied for 7 patents, all of which were granted, all of which were subsequently recognized as among the most important patents in the history of electrical engineering. He demonstrated the system before the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in May 1888. The presentation was, by the accounts of the engineers who attended, extraordinary, not merely in the technical content, which was revolutionary, but in the manner of the presentation, which had the quality of a man who had lived with these ideas for 6 years and could explain them with the effortless clarity of absolute mastery. The AC induction motor ran before them with a smoothness and a silence that the sputtering, sparking DC motors of the Edison system never achieved. The numbers Tesla presented for efficiency and transmission range were simply better, demonstrably, verifiably, undeniably better than anything DC could offer. In the audience that night was a representative of George Westinghouse. George Westinghouse was, in 1888, the other great electrical entrepreneur of the American Gilded Age. A man who had made a considerable fortune from the Westinghouse air brake, a device that made railroad travel significantly safer, and who had been developing a competing electrical distribution system based on alternating current for several years. He had been following the theoretical work on AC with the interest of an entrepreneur who understands, from a business standpoint, what superior technology means. When he saw Tesla's demonstration, he understood immediately. He visited Tesla's laboratory. He spent hours with him, asking questions with the focused intelligence of an engineer-turned-businessman who could evaluate what he was seeing without requiring anyone to translate it for him. And then he made Tesla an offer, $100,000 for his patents, plus royalties of $250 per horsepower of electrical capacity sold using the Tesla system, plus a consulting arrangement. $100,000. In 1888, to a man who had been digging ditches 3 years earlier. Tesla accepted, and the war of currents began. The war of currents, the battle between Edison's direct current system and Westinghouse's alternating current system for control of the American electrical market, is one of the great corporate conflicts in the history of technology, and it was fought with a ferocity and a disregard for scruple that stands as a monument to what happens when brilliant men and enormous financial interests collide. Edison, understanding that the Tesla-Westinghouse AC system threatened to make his DC infrastructure obsolete, launched a campaign to discredit alternating current on public safety grounds. His argument was technically valid, as far as it went. AC at the high voltages required for long-distance transmission was genuinely more dangerous to touch than DC at the lower voltages used in Edison's distribution system. People could be killed by AC. This was true. What Edison did with this truth was, by any fair assessment, a piece of propaganda so cynical and so effective that it deserves more attention than it typically receives. He and his associates began publicly electrocuting animals with alternating current, dogs, calves, and eventually, in a demonstration that attracted significant newspaper coverage, a circus elephant named Topsy, to demonstrate AC's lethal potential. He lobbied, successfully, for the adoption of AC in the first electric chair, reasoning that if the state of New York associated alternating current with execution, the public would not welcome it in their homes. He coined a term for death by electrocution, being Westinghoused. This campaign was, at the level of pure tactics, brilliant. At the level of honesty, it was a deliberate misrepresentation of the complete picture, which was that AC, properly engineered with appropriate insulation and grounding, was no more dangerous in practice than DC, and that its massive technical advantages in transmission and motor operation made it the only practical basis for a national electrical grid. Edison knew this. His own engineers told him. He chose to fight anyway, because the financial and personal stakes were too high for him to accept the alternative. Tesla watched all of this with a revulsion that he never quite managed to conceal. He found the animal electrocutions not merely cruel but personally offensive. He had, throughout his life, a genuine tenderness for animals, particularly pigeons, that expressed itself in behavior his contemporaries found eccentric and that we might recognize as the behavior of a profoundly sensitive person in a world that did not particularly reward sensitivity. He had no taste for the combat. He had no interest in the politics. He wanted to work, to build, to discover, to advance the science. The spectacle of his inventions being used as weapons in a corporate war made him feel something very close to despair. But Westinghouse was winning. The technical case for AC was too strong to be permanently suppressed by propaganda, and the commercial case was even stronger. The decisive moment came in 1893 when Westinghouse, using Tesla's patents and Tesla's system, won the contract to light the Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, which was the single most attended event in American history to that point. Nearly 30 million people came to see an entire city illuminated by electric light. Not the Edison DC light of Lower Manhattan, familiar to New Yorkers but unknown to most Americans, but the brilliant, white, steady AC light of the Westinghouse Tesla system, the light that burned from 100,000 bulbs along the midway and reflected off the white facades of the exhibition buildings and created, in the Chicago evening, something that looked to people who had spent their entire lives under oil lamp and candlelight like a vision of the future. They were right. It was. The following year, 1894, Westinghouse won the contract to build the first great hydroelectric power station at Niagara Falls. Tesla had been dreaming about Niagara Falls since childhood, had told an uncle at age 7 that he would one day put the power of that falling water to work, and the uncle had smiled at the charming ambition of a small child. Now he was designing the machinery that would actually do it. The Niagara generators, massive AC generators built to Tesla's designs, transmitting power over the high-tension lines that Tesla had theorized, stepping it down through the transformers that Tesla had engineered, began operation in 1896. They could power the entire city of Buffalo. They could, in theory, power the entire eastern seaboard. Tesla stood at Niagara Falls and felt, he said, a satisfaction so complete that he found it difficult to describe. This was the moment he had seen in the park in Budapest 14 years earlier. The vision made physical. The mathematics made electrical. The entire modern world, in its basic electrical architecture, switched on. Edison had lost the war of currents. Not completely. DC survived in specific applications, and the full transition to AC would take decades and the development of new technologies. But the fundamental question of which system would power the modern world had been answered. Alternating current had won. Nikola Tesla had won. He should have been a very rich man. He was not. The story of what happened to Tesla's wealth, or rather, what never became Tesla's wealth, is one of the most painful passages in the entire history of technological capitalism. Westinghouse, in 1897, came to Tesla with a problem. The company was in financial difficulty, partly as a result of the costs of fighting the war of currents, partly as a result of the royalty agreement with Tesla, which had become, as the scale of AC adoption grew, a payment obligation of potentially enormous size. Westinghouse explained to Tesla, with the directness of a man who was not accustomed to begging and found the experience uncomfortable, that the royalty payments threatened to bankrupt the company. That the company might not survive if it had to continue paying the amounts that the agreement specified. Tesla listened. He thought. And then he tore up the contract. Tore it up. Literally and figuratively. He relinquished the royalty rights that, had they been maintained, would have made him one of the wealthiest men in the United States. Royalties that, by the time AC power reached its full national deployment, would have amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars. He gave up this fortune because, he said, Westinghouse had believed in him when no one else would, had given him the resources to prove what he knew to be true, had been a fair partner. To let that man's company fail over a contract seemed to Tesla not merely ungrateful but actively wrong. This decision, extraordinary in its generosity and its financial self-destructiveness, revealed something fundamental about Tesla's relationship to money. He did not think about it the way most people think about it. Money was a means to an end, and the end was the work. The laboratory, the experiments, the devices waiting to be built and the phenomena waiting to be discovered and the laws of nature waiting to be uncovered and put to human use. If money was available, he spent it on the work. If it was not available, he found a way to keep working anyway. The idea that money might be worth accumulating for its own sake, for security, for status, for the freedom of not needing to find it, this idea appears to have been essentially foreign to his psychology. This is a beautiful quality in a saint. In an inventor operating in the patent law-haunted world of Gilded Age American capitalism, it was a catastrophic vulnerability. With the royalties gone, Tesla had to rely on his patents for income and on investors who might fund new work. For a while, the early 1890s, when his reputation was at its peak, this was not difficult. He was, in those years, the most famous scientist in America, possibly in the world. He gave lectures that were described, by the people who attended them, as theatrical events, demonstrations of electrical phenomena that no one had ever seen before, conducted with the showmanship of a born performer who had nothing of the performer in him except the absolute command of his material and the extraordinary physical presence that made every audience believe they were in the proximity of something genuinely unusual. He would hold in his bare hands electrical conductors carrying hundreds of thousands of volts and allow the current to pass through his body, demonstrating to the gasping audience that AC at high frequency was not lethal, that the body could serve as a conductor without harm. He would light lamps without wires by resonant induction, holding them up in the darkened lecture hall while they glowed impossibly, wirelessly, fed by the electrical field he had created around himself. He demonstrated, for audiences that included the most educated and sophisticated people in New York and Europe, phenomena that no one else on Earth had produced and that no one else on Earth fully understood. The lectures made him famous and made him no money. But they made him something potentially more valuable. They made him irresistible to the press, which covered him with a fascination that alternated between celebration and bafflement, and they made him irresistible to the wealthy patrons who were, in the absence of any formal system for funding scientific research, the only available source of capital for the kind of large-scale experimental work he wanted to do. The most significant of these patrons was J.P. Morgan. In 1900, the same J.P. Morgan who was at that moment reorganizing the steel industry and managing the American financial system from his locked library, agreed to invest $150,000 in Tesla's most ambitious project to date. A project that, if it worked, would not merely improve the electrical system that already existed. It would transform the entire relationship between human beings and energy at a planetary scale. The Wardenclyffe Tower. To understand Wardenclyffe, you have to understand what Tesla believed he had discovered in the years between 1896 and 1900, during a period of research so intense and so productive that it amounted to a second career, a second revolution in thinking, building on the first. Working in his Colorado Springs laboratory in 1899, equipped with the most powerful electrical generating equipment then in existence, Tesla had conducted a series of experiments with the propagation of electrical energy through the Earth itself. He had discovered, or believed he had discovered, and the distinction matters enormously as we will see, that the Earth was a conductor of extraordinary quality, and that by generating electrical oscillations at the right frequency, an inventor could cause resonant vibrations to travel through the globe itself, emerging at any point on the surface to deliver electrical power to a receiver tuned to the same frequency. Free energy. Wireless energy. Electrical power available anywhere on Earth at any time, without wires, without transmission infrastructure, without the cost and the complexity of the distribution systems that Edison and Westinghouse had spent decades and fortunes building. Power that a receiving station in Bombay could draw from a transmitter in New York. Power that a ship in the middle of the Atlantic could pull from the air around it. Power for every human being on Earth, regardless of geography or wealth. This was not, in 1900, immediately dismissed as impossible. Tesla was, at that moment, the most credible inventor in the world. The man who had conceived the AC induction motor in a Budapest park and then built it, exactly as conceived, exactly as it worked in his mind, had earned a degree of credibility with rational observers that made it very difficult to simply declare his next idea impossible. He had been right before. He had been right when people more credentialed and more experienced told him he was wrong. Dismissing Tesla was a risk that thoughtful people were reluctant to take twice. Morgan gave him the money. Tesla acquired land at Wardenclyffe, on the north shore of Long Island. He hired Stanford White, the most famous architect in America, to design the laboratory building. He began construction of the tower, a 200-foot wooden structure topped with a massive copper hemisphere, designed to pump electrical energy into the ionosphere and through the Earth with a power that Tesla calculated could reach every corner of the globe. And then, partway through the construction, Tesla went to Morgan with a revised proposal. He told Morgan that Wardenclyffe could be more than a power transmission station. It could be a global wireless communication system, could send messages, images, information to any point on Earth. It was, in essence, the Internet, the wireless, globe-spanning information network that would arrive, in recognizable form, a century later. Morgan read the proposal. He read it with the attention that a man of his analytical capability gives to any significant business proposition, which is to say, he read it completely, he thought about it seriously, and he arrived at the conclusion that would end the Wardenclyffe project and, in a very real sense, end Tesla's career. His question, reportedly, was brief and lethal. If wireless power and wireless communication were available to anyone, anywhere, with just a simple receiver, if the infrastructure was free effectively once the tower was built, then where was the meter? Where was the mechanism for charging people for what they used? How did Morgan make money from a system that, by its fundamental design, made energy and information universally available without individual billing? Tesla had no answer. He had never thought about the question. The question, to his mind, was not the right question. The right question was whether it was possible, whether it would work, whether it would benefit humanity. The question of how to monetize it was, to him, literally a lesser order of concern, a detail to be sorted out later by businessmen after the thing was built and working. Morgan saw it differently. He declined to provide additional funding. Without Morgan's backing, other investors who had been considering their own contributions withdrew. The Wardenclyffe Tower project slowed, stalled, and eventually collapsed. The tower itself, never completed to Tesla's design, stood for years as a monument to abandoned ambition before being torn down in 1917 and sold for scrap to pay Tesla's debts to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel where he had been living on credit. Tesla was, by this point, in the grip of a mental and physical unraveling that had been building for years. The stress of the failed projects, the financial desperation, the accumulated frustration of a man whose ideas consistently ran 10 or 20 or 50 years ahead of the technology available to implement them. All of this had taken its toll on a constitution that was, even in its strongest years, highly strung. He developed an obsessive-compulsive disorder, not as a diagnosis, in the early 20th century, but as a recognizable behavioral pattern. The need to calculate the cubic content of every food before he ate it, the inability to touch anything bearing curves, the requirement to circle a building 3 times before entering it, the deep revulsion toward pearls, which he could not bear to see on women's ears, and that caused him to leave the room when one of his female acquaintances wore them. These behaviors intensified under stress. They became, in the Wardenclyffe years and after, a significant impediment to normal social functioning. He had never been good at normal social functioning. He had lived his entire adult life as a bachelor with a series of close friendships, some of them with women of considerable intelligence and accomplishment, women who found him fascinating and who he found intellectually stimulating, that never became romantic relationships as far as anyone has been able to determine. He said late in life that romantic love was an obstacle to the life of the mind, that the energy required for intimate partnership was energy he could not afford to spend. Whether this was a genuine belief or a rationalization of a deeper incapacity for intimacy is a question his biographers have argued about for decades and not resolved. What is clear is that he was, for most of his life, genuinely alone, sustained by his work, by his friendships, and by the pigeons. The pigeons. This detail appears in every serious account of Tesla's later years, because it is so specific and so poignant and so illuminating of the human being underneath the inventor that it is impossible to omit. In his final decades, living on a very small income from patent royalties and the charity of friends, Tesla became increasingly devoted to the flock of pigeons that gathered in Bryant Park and in front of the New York Public Library. He fed them every day. He recognized individual birds. He tracked their habits and their relationships with the attentiveness that, in his working years, he had brought to the behavior of electrical phenomena. And when one of them, a white female pigeon with gray wingtips, whom he described in terms that leave no doubt that he regarded her with something very close to love, became ill, he brought her to his hotel room and nursed her personally, spending money he could not afford on veterinary care, sitting up through the night to tend to her, grieving when she died, with a depth of feeling that he expressed in writing with a directness he rarely brought to descriptions of his human relationships. He said of this pigeon that he had loved her as a man loves a woman. He said it without self-consciousness or qualification. He said it as a simple fact, the way he stated all facts. In his later years, he continued to announce inventions and discoveries to the press. Some of these announcements were genuine. He had genuine insights, genuine advances, right up until the end. The Tesla coil, which he had demonstrated in the 1890s, became the foundation of modern radio technology. His patents on radio transmission, which predated Marconi's, and which the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in 1943, the year Tesla died, had priority over Marconi's, established him as the true inventor of radio. His work on resonant frequency and standing waves was foundational to the development of radar. His theoretical work on robotics, the teleautomaton, a radio-controlled boat that he demonstrated in Madison Square Garden in 1898, anticipated robotics and remote control by decades. And some of his later announcements were, or appeared to be, the products of a mind that had begun to lose the thread between vision and reality. He announced, periodically, that he had intercepted signals from extraterrestrial intelligence. He announced a death ray, a particle beam weapon capable of destroying aircraft at a distance of 250 miles. He described the fundamental principles of a device that could split the Earth, that could, by applying resonant frequency at precisely the right pitch, cause the crust of the planet to vibrate itself to pieces. He was alternately described by the press as a prophet and a madman, and the two characterizations were, in those later years, genuinely difficult to separate, because the line between his genuine prescience and his genuine delusion had become blurred in ways that made honest assessment very difficult. The press he had once courted and that had once celebrated him had learned to treat his announcements with a mixture of fascination and mockery that he found humiliating but could not avoid, because he needed the press coverage and could not access it except by providing the dramatic announcements that the press wanted. He was 70 years old, living on a tiny stipend from the Westinghouse Company and occasional gifts from friends, making his headquarters in a succession of New York hotels from which he was periodically evicted for non-payment of bills, and the gap between what he had been and what he had become was a gulf that opened beneath him every morning when he woke up and did not close until sleep. He moved, in his final years, to the Hotel New Yorker, room 3327. He lived there alone, with the pigeons he brought in through the window and tended with the devotion he could no longer bring to his experiments. He worked, or at least he thought, which for him had always been the same thing. He made notes. The world barely noticed. There was a war on. There were larger stories. The inventor who had conceived the electrical system that powered the factories building the weapons and the ships and the aircraft of the Second World War died in a New York hotel room with 2 days' decomposition and no mourners, and the newspapers gave him the kind of obituary that acknowledges greatness while conveying, in their brevity and their placement, that the moment of that greatness has already passed. But it had not passed. It had not passed then. It has not passed now. It will not pass for as long as electrical power exists on Earth, which is to say, it has not passed and it will not pass. Every time a motor turns, in a factory, in a hospital, in a household appliance, in the electric car driving down the street outside your window, it turns on the principle that a 25-year-old Serbian engineer saw in his mind in a Budapest park, drew in the dirt with a stick, and spent the rest of his life fighting to give to the world. Every time you plug something into a wall socket and it runs, you are benefiting from the work of a man who was denied the royalties that would have rewarded him for it, who was dismissed and ridiculed and underfunded and ultimately forgotten while the infrastructure of his creation powered the civilization that forgot him. This is the injustice of the Tesla story. But it is not, in the end, the most important thing about it. The most important thing is the other direction, the direction the story points forward rather than backward. Tesla understood things that we are still catching up to. His work on wireless energy transmission is the direct ancestor of the wireless charging systems that are now appearing in consumer electronics. His work on resonant frequency transmission is the theoretical basis of the systems now being developed to transmit solar power from orbit. His theoretical descriptions of a world of wireless communication, of information freely available anywhere, transmitted through the air itself, are not prophecy in retrospect. They are engineering specification. He was not mad. He was early. There is a specific, devastating kind of genius that consists of being right before the world has the tools to verify your rightness, of seeing the destination before the road exists, of understanding the answer to a question that has not yet been formally asked. This kind of genius is indistinguishable, in the moment of its expression, from delusion. It requires the world to wait, sometimes decades, sometimes more than a century, before the evidence arrives that the vision was genuine. Tesla was this kind of genius, the most pure expression of this kind of genius that the modern world has produced. He was born in a lightning storm in a Serbian village, the son of a poet priest and an engineer mother, in a century that was being remade by electricity, and could not have guessed, on the day of his birth, how much of that remaking would pass through the mind of the child lying in the house on the hill. He lived through triumph and poverty and madness and genius and the specific loneliness of a man whose inner life was so rich and so unusual that the ordinary human world could never quite accommodate it. He died alone in a hotel room, unmourned, his papers seized by a government that was not sure what he had left behind. He had left behind the world. This world, the one running on his system, lit by his principles, connected by the wireless transmission he envisioned and never lived to see completed. He had left behind, in short, everything, and been given, in return, a room with a window, a flock of pigeons, and the cold particular silence of a January morning in 1943. But listen, in the wall beside you as you watch this, there is a wire, and in that wire, at 60 cycles per second, alternating current is flowing, the current that Tesla conceived, and argued for and proved and gave away. It is flowing right now. It has been flowing, somewhere in the world, every moment since 1896. It will continue to flow long after everyone who remembers his name has forgotten it, and long after everyone who has forgotten it was born. That is his monument, not a statue, not a prize, not the fortune he should have had and never received. The current in the wire, the light in the room, the world, this entire extraordinary electrical connected world running, whether it knows it or not, on Nikola Tesla. He saw it all. In a park. In Budapest. On a February afternoon. In 1882. He always saw everything. He just saw it alone.